will bring an end to occupation, new hope for Palestine. Thousands shout around the world, peace and justice in our time.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. This is an incredible turnout. Standing room only. We can see how important the cause is, Labor for Palestine is in Vancouver. So thank you all so much for being here. So I'll start by introducing the event very briefly, and I'll pass it over to my co-MC, Rogine. I'll introduce myself as I'm Kayla Hillstaub. I am a member of the TSSU. I'm also part of the Center for Socialist Education, which is the space we're in today. It's a really important leftist space, as you can see, for so many of us to gather under the broad banner of leftism, of anti-imperialism, and for doing all these important kinds of events. I'm also part of the Vancouver Peace Council, which is also a sponsor of this event, which is also an anti-imperialist organization involved in all kinds of peace movements across the world, including, of course, solidarity with Palestine. I want to mention a few notes about tonight. We are filming the event, but only people who have consented to filming. So that's going to be, certain parts of the introduction. We've got greetings here from different folks. We've got panelists here. But of course, when we're doing a conversation or when unionists are speaking, as we've asked you to do, we're not going to be filming that part. So just to be clear. I'm going to pass it over to Rogine to talk a little bit about why we're here today, the urgency for convening a Labor for Palestine organization, given what's happening in Palestine, given the murder of civilians, given the colonization of Palestine, and the urgency of doing something today as trade union activists. So take it away, Rogine. I'll pass it over to you.
So happy that there's such a big turnout. I apologize for those of you that don't have a seat. But with that said, let's make the best out of this event. Just a little bit about myself. My name is Rogine Amati, and I'm a high school teacher and an active member of the BCTF. And I'm very proud of being active and doing union work. And part of that work is showing up and doing solidarity work with Palestine. I'm also privileged enough to be teaching social justice, so I integrate a lot of what it means to stand with Palestine every day in my classroom. And of course, I know myself and other educators have been, given a lot of flack, and there has been a lot of policing lately about what work that we're doing, what we're teaching in the classroom, and students that want to get involved and show their solidarity being shut down in different ways. So it's unfortunate that that's happening, but it doesn't make us stop wanting to fight. Before we formally start this event, which is Labor in Solidarity with Palestine, of course, I want to acknowledge the lands that we are on. Right now, we're on the lands of the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples from the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam nations. And I always teach my students that there's a variety of different Indigenous nations that existed here prior to colonization. There was almost 70 million different individuals and people and groups that lived here. And in comparison, there were 80 million people living in Europe at the time. And it was through the colonial process that 90% of the people living on these lands were wiped out through brutal genocide, through colonization. And firstly, I think there's many things that we can learn from the different Indigenous nations that lived here. Many of them had egalitarian structures. Many of them had very different gender relations than we did here. And I think same goes with Palestine. And I think what we are seeing right now, of course, this is proven by scholars, by human rights organizations, by the United Nations, that what's going on is not just a war, it is genocide. And there's some people that want to deny this reality. I've had even colleagues say that, why are you comparing, colonization here on this land to what's happening in Palestine? But, when we have videos of Israeli government officials comparing Palestinians to animals, dehumanizing them, when you justifying their criminal acts, their genocidal acts by saying that the majority of people whom in fact were children that they killed were terrorists, or having clear videos of IDF soldiers saying, we occupy, we cleanse, we settle. What more proof do you need that this is a colonial and genocidal action that is taking place in Palestine right now? And so With that said, regardless of whether it be here on Turtle Island or in Palestine, as long as there's colonization, there's always been resistance. Indigenous peoples here continue to resist and fight for their lands. And as we see right now, the people of Palestine and those that are standing in solidarity with Palestine are fighting, and they're not going to give up in the face of Zionist oppression, apartheid, genocide, so on and so forth. And I'll just finish my few words with, I think, this amazing and powerful quote by anti-apartheid activist Desmond Tutu from South Africa, who says that if you are neutral in the face of injustice, you have taken the side of the oppressor. And right now, we cannot have labor be neutral. We need labor to stand up, and that's why we're here having this event. You know, a lot of people are afraid to speak, and we're going to talk about some of the reasons why, you know, conflating being anti-Zionist with anti-Semitism. Or, you know, just afraid of taking a firm stance. But I think only the first step is the fight for ceasefire, is a fight against this genocide happening. But we have to go even beyond that. We have to take a firm stand as labor activists against occupation, against illegal settlements, against genocide, so on and so forth. And at the same time recognize that Palestinians have the right to resist, regardless. They have the right to resist. This is a right recognized by the United Nations. And we've been there as labor activists throughout history for various different movements, standing with various different movements. Why are we not on the streets right now? Why are we not holding our union flags, proud at these rallies that these folks have organized, bringing in tens of thousands of people on the streets? What we need is to be out there. So again, I don't want to take up too much space. This is the first step, is coming here, having a dialogue. We have really great leaflets up at the front that have documents on how labor could stand in solidarity with Palestine. We have a very powerful statement printed by Cup W that kind of shows us and is an inspiration for us on what we can do to pass really great statements in our unions. And of course, this is an opening to start a Labor for Palestine chapter here in Vancouver, because we don't want this event to just stop here. So if you are in a union, I really urge you to write down your information at the front. We want to have our opening meeting Wednesday, December 13th, just to get things started. We'll repeat this at the end of the event, but please sign up, please get involved. This is just one event. So thank you so much, and we'll get started with our program, and Kayla's going to start us off. Thank you.
Rogine, and thanks to all of you for being part of this resistance that Rogine is talking about, this really important resistance that labor is going to show up for, and that we are going to organize here tonight as a collective, as united front of resistance against Zionism, against genocide, against colonization of Palestine. So with that, I'm going to walk us through a little bit of the program tonight, just so we all know what to expect. We're going to start with some greetings from Labor for Palestine in Ontario. We have some greetings from the World Peace Council. We have greetings from the General Union of Palestinian Workers. And next we have union greetings from all the folks in the audience, or as part of the room here. We're going to hear some music actually from some incredible artists here. Rogine, I think you can speak to a little bit more about that, but that's also happening tonight. And then we're going to move to our panel speakers here tonight. We have Omri Haven, Charlotte Cates, and Hannah Kawas. And then we're going to open it up for a broad discussion. So we have a tight program here tonight. We have a lot to discuss. And as Rogine said, this is just the first step in convening this organization, Labor for Palestine, under this united front. So with that, I'm going to introduce, right? Yeah, I'm going to introduce our representative from Labor for Palestine. We have James Hutt joining us here on Zoom. He's a union organizer and writer on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory in Ottawa. He's a member of the Coordinating Committee of Labor for Palestine and is a member of the Canadian Office and Professional Employees Union, or COPE, Local 225. He's also a father of the most amazing Palestinian daughter. So we'll pass the floor over to James. Welcome.
Hey James, are you there?
I'm here, yeah.
Okay, you were speaking to a room packed with people, so welcome and thank you for being here.
Amazing. Thank you. I'm so excited. I don't know if you said my bio yet. I'm just tuning in just now, but I'm really excited to meet you all, albeit virtually. I'm a member of the Coordinating Committee of Palestine. I'm based here in Ottawa, and run right about from Anishinaabe territory.
Sorry guys.
Awesome. Yeah.
Sorry.
Just off the top, sisters, brothers, comrades, I'm really excited to hear what you're all talking about. Palestine, Live Palestine. I'm excited that you're talking about it together, cross unions in Vancouver tonight. I think there's tons of potential here. I just wanted to come in, give greetings, say a couple words about Live Palestine, and kind of mark the momentous thing that you're doing, that we're all doing right now, and adding our voices and our power in the fight for the liberation of Palestine. Now, Live for Palestine is a pan-Canadian network of trade union activists from coast to coast, from public and private sector unions, working to deepen solidarity with Palestinian workers and people in their fight for liberation. We are all volunteer-run. We're doing this, off the side of our desks, and we've been around since 2005, where we got active in the trade union movement and picked up the call for BDS, that is Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, that came out from the Palestinian community as a way to support them around the world. And so we picked up that call for BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, and looked to the labor movement and helped, at the time, educate a number of trade union members and unions and get them to pass BDS resolutions. We had a number of huge victories. We worked across unions, labor councils, and federations of labor, and got a number of key victories, including QB Ontario to pass BDS. If I recall correctly, they were one of the first in Anglo-Canada. Quebec has always been ahead. And Anglo-Canada to pass BDS, Boycott, Divestments, and Sanctions. And at the time, those people in Labour Palestine who talked about being there, having to be escorted in and making sure that they were not being attacked by Zionists at the time, and winning that on the convention floor, and then laying the groundwork for all support that QP Ontario has done since then. And along with that, shortly after, the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, CPW, and PSAC, as well as unions in Quebec. And in winning those resolutions, we laid the groundwork for a lot of long-term, lasting solidarity with working people here in Canada and in Palestine. One of my favorite examples is with CPW. CPW has a very strong linkage to their counterpart in Palestine, Palestinian Postal Workers Union. They have done numerous trips of delegations and solidarity, and bringing Palestinian postal workers to Canada, frequently to their conventions to talk and to share their experience and the commonality that we as working people have. After about 6 to 7 years, Live Palestine went to a bit of dormancy, and we revived about 4 or 5 years ago now, and really tried to see what else we could be doing. We had key victories for BDS, including in that time the Public Service Alliance in Canada, but we realized what was happening was that a number of unions had passed BDS, but weren't doing much to actually implement it. And so we wanted to think about how do we make it real? How do we get unions to start thinking about the ways that our workplaces and our unions are complicit in Israeli apartheid? And what role do we have in pushing on the Canadian state and in advocating in numerous ways throughout Canadian society? And just to spell it out, we work in trade unions and labor unions for a number of reasons. One is simply because of scale. The trade union movement in Canada is about 11.5 million people. It represents almost 30% of the entire Canadian population. So you think about how do you reach a mass number of people. The trade union movement has a membership and a base like no other organization that even comes close to it in Canada. And thinking about how to reach them, how to do education, how to mobilize, how to bring them into collective mass action. But also resources. Of course, the trade unions have tons of resources at their disposal. They have millions that they can use for political advocacy, for solidarity delegations, and for general resourcing to fund activism and the fight for solidarity with Palestine. 3, because trade unions are important social and cultural institutions. What they do has a ripple effect throughout society, both in setting influence and encouraging others to do, but also in the sense of their own scope of their operations, thinking about what our unions are doing in terms of our pensions and our procurement and how the policies we're passing. All of that has a large impact and ripples throughout society. The 4th is because of collective bargaining. The labor relations framework in Canada has a number of flaws, but when you win something in collective bargaining, it becomes law, it becomes legal, and that gives you all sorts of recourse to solidify it and to defend it. But then the biggest reason that we work in the trade union movement is because of power. Working people have power by coming together and thinking about how do we take a stand and withdraw our labor at various points in the system, be it production, distribution, and reproduction. That is the way that the greatest social change in history has ever happened. I had a mentor of mine once, actually a Canadian Union of Postal Workers, a CPW member, told me that unless you have the power to shut shit down, all that your advocacy amounts to is begging. And so we have to think about what we're doing as people to actually build the power to shut things down and to stop injustice. And so since the last couple of months, since October 7th and before, we've been working on a number of key issues to really heighten the solidarity of Palestinian workers and people and to undermine Canadian complicity. I'm sure you'll feel tonight about all the ways that Canada is complicit in funding and supporting and arming Israeli apartheid. But it's not just an issue of abstract justice or morality abroad in the Middle East. Canada has and has always been a chief architect and partner in Israeli apartheid and in the ongoing colonization of Palestine. So we work to highlight that, to highlight those linkages, and to highlight often the shameful history that Canadian labor unions have had in terms of supporting Israel, in terms of supporting the colonization of Palestine. Principally, we do education. We just actually had a fantastic teach-in tonight where hundreds of people were on and learning about Palestine, what we can do with workers. We do train-the-trainer sessions. We reach different unions. We had another one with PSAC about a week or two ago where we had 400 members come, learn, and we're now rolling it out at different locals and are happy to do it in every union, local labor council, and federation if you're interested in that. But also we pass resolutions. Since October 7th, we've passed a number of key resolutions, including calling for ceasefires, calling for aid, but calling for an end to the occupation and calling for BDS. We're seeing this pick up steam across the country where labor unions are passing resolutions and dedicating them to action. And learning from the earlier era of Live with Palestine where we passed these key BDS resolutions, we're also thinking long term and how do we actually make the resolutions commit the labor body, be it a union, a local federation, whatever, to do ongoing education, to do delegations to Palestine, to actually investigate the pension funds. So putting in those mechanisms for accountability and for long-term action. We work with unions to implement BDS both in their workplace, thinking about all the ways that their workplaces are purchasing goods made in occupied Palestinian territories, supporting companies that profit off of the colonization of Palestine, or within their own unions, thinking about procurement. Of course, I don't need to go through the BDS list, but HP printers is a big one that comes up again and again. We're looking at the pension unions and how do we actually divest from Israel and start having those knock-on effects. And there's a number of union-specific campaigns that we can do to help make BDS real. Going back to CPW, one of the really messed up things is, I'm trying not to swear here, one of the really messed up things is that Canada Post actually does not recognize Palestine on outgoing mail. So we're working with the Canadian postal workers to push on that, to challenge that, to think about how do we get postal workers to direct the mail, to take action, to get it to Palestine in coordination with their counterpart in Palestine. Also, the Union of Postal Unions around the country, internationally, the Global Postal Unions Federation recognizes Israel as a member, but Palestine only as an observer. So there's work there to be done. Just one example of the different ways that our unions, specifically in their own context, can take action for the liberation of Palestine. We've done delegations to Palestine in the past. We're looking at doing them again. They're a great way to build key and lasting connections and do education with members. And the other thing is we're doing mass action. We've been getting people out in the streets. We've been supporting rallies that have happened almost weekly, sometimes more than once a week in many cities around the country. We've helped organize 17 sit-ins of MP offices around the country. We've coordinated blockades of weapons manufacturers, and we're targeting key politicians and getting union members out to take the streets. We're a big part of we were one of the key organizers of the National March on Ottawa that happened just last weekend with tens of thousands of people here marching in the capital. And then the final thing that we're looking at and what we need to do is think about job action, right? We think about what it'll actually take for Canada to stand for justice on Palestine, to call not just for a ceasefire, but to end aid to Israel, to end arms sales, to call and for sanctions on Israel. It's a very huge ask because we're talking about actually breaking with our partner in the US, the dominant partner there, and breaking with the logic of imperialism around the world. And so what we need to do is figure out how do we have the power to shut things down. And as working people, all of our power comes from that. There's a number of really inspiring examples throughout Canadian history of workers and community allies coming together to shut things down and to refuse that injustice, to impose a real financial, economic cost on those in power until they meet our demands. And there's long histories of longshore workers doing that. You know, in St. John, decades ago, protests the Argentinian dictatorship. But also here recently, in 2021, there was the massively inspiring Block the Boat campaign for the Israeli ship Zim that went all along the west coast. And it happened in Prince Rupert, where activists came together and created a community picket line that many longshore workers refused to cross. And it delayed the unloading of the Zim ship. It cost tons of money. It had a real material cost. Now, the boat was ultimately unloaded because the longshore workers can't do it themselves. The labor law system we're operating under imposes huge risks and costs for workers willing to act out or defy labor laws. And this time, where things are at, the rest of the labor movement, unlike in the past, was not ready there to offer funding, offer support to help them defy unjust labor laws and to keep going. So it's something we have to build towards. We have to be thinking about how do we do that mass education, that mass action and engagement to the point where we actually have a labor movement capable of fighting again, capable of resisting these unjust labor laws and building power to win. I don't want to take much more of your time because I'm sure you've got an incredible night, but I'm very excited this could be happening. I can't see you all, but I'm sure the energy in the room is beautiful and electric because you're talking about how do working people actually reclaim their power? How do they come together and start changing the things that matter? And when you do that and start cohering that and building consciousness and taking action in a union, it moves things. And when you do it across unions, when you start cohering people and deepening those linkages of solidarity, deepening what we think is possible, deepening what we think is politically possible, and for whom, that's when the whole game starts to change. And so I'm very thrilled to see this all happening, and I wish you well, and just wanted to send messages of solidarity. Thank you. Thank you, comrades.
Huge thanks to you, James, for being here and sharing some of the importance of the work of Labor for Palestine, some of the tactics you're using, some of the successes that you've had, and how we as workers can leverage our power in liberation of Palestine. I think that's all why we're all here tonight.
I just want to thank all our unionists that came out and gave such powerful statements right now. That was it was so inspiring to see that there are unionists, there are unions that are standing with Palestine, there are individuals fighting the fight to stand with Palestine, and the movement lives. We're not going to be silenced. So we're going to have a little intermission, and we're going to hear from some fantastic musicians. We're going to hear from a local Vancouver-based root folk group singing band called the Graham Partisans, and they have a song for Palestine called The Ballad of Rachel Corrie. So what we're going to do is just going to take a minute to rearrange the front, and I just want to thank you all for standing. I apologize. I mean, a decade ago when we were organizing alongside these folks, we couldn't get 15 people out, and I didn't realize that we would have a turnout like this. Otherwise, we would have gone in a bigger space. But thank you for being patient with us, and in the future, we'll be very mindful of that. So thanks again, and we'll set up, and yeah, it's worth it.
Thank you kindly. This is a song that was written about 15, 16 years ago by a political activist in the BC Teachers Federation named Rob Rosen. And like myself, we tried for many, many years to bring issues of support for Palestinians to the various different levels of democracy inside the union, sometimes with success, sometimes with not success. And This is a song about Rachel Corrie, who in 2003, with other activists from the International Solidarity Movement, went to Palestine to practice nonviolent resistance, and she was standing in front of the house of a dentist. And part of the Israeli Defense Forces strategy at the time was if you were related to somebody who was arrested and charged with something, they would bulldoze her house. And so this was the house of a dentist. She stood in front of it, and the bulldozer ran right over and killed her. The song is called The Ballad of Rachel Corrie. There's a wall in San Francisco with painted faces you can name. Amidst this group of heroes is a face that mocks the shame of a brutal occupation that keeps a people's rights denied, and a young woman's courage to stand up against the tide. Rachel Corrie was 23 years old when she left her home and friends. From Libya to Palestine, where she met her tragic end. In the little town of Rafah, on that fateful afternoon, big bulldozers on the move, tearing down another home, bringing an end to occupation, new hope for Palestine. Thousands shout around the world, peace and justice in our time. Well, there was nothing very special in Rafah town that day. Same thing happens every week from Bethlehem to Ramallah. Children murdered on the ground for the crime of throwing stones. Soldiers at the checkpoints tearing down another home. I'll bring an end to occupation, new hope for Palestine. Thousands shout around the world, peace and justice in our time. Now Rachel Corrie had a conscience. It made her stand her ground. That bulldozer drove right through her, and it slammed her body down. They took her to the hospital, that's where she died that night. And her parents mourn her every day, and they still keep up the fight. Now there is another wall to fence a people's will, keep children separate from their schools and farmers from their fields. Now it's up to you and me whether Rachel died in vain. Will we stand together to try to end this pain, or bring an end to occupation, new hope for Palestine? Thousands shout around the world, peace and justice in our time. Thousands shout around the world, peace and justice in our time. Thank you very much. It's so great to be here with you tonight.
It was beautiful. Yeah. So we are going to hear from our main speakers. Thanks again for the three of them for waiting patiently. And While we're setting up, I'll give a little introduction on who we're going to be hearing from. So up first, we have Omri Haven, who's an anti-Zionist Jewish trade unionist, part of Jews Against Genocide. He is a worker and a researcher based in the Salish territories of Vancouver. He is currently completing an MA in communication at SFU on agrivoltaics, but has worked on food justice issues for the past 15 years. He has been a leader in 2 student unions and 2 labor unions, and has been involved in several Palestinian liberation groups since a very young age. He was born in Saskatoon, but also grew up in Halifax, and he is now enjoying the much more agreeable weather on the coastal Pacific rainforest. So that's Omri, and he's going to be our first speaker. I'll introduce Charlotte and Hannah and let them share the mic. So up next, after Omri, we have Charlotte Cates, who's International Coordinator of Samidoun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network. She's also an organizer with the National Lawyers Guild International Committee in the US and the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, as well as the Canadian BDS Coalition. So give it away for Charlotte as well. And certainly last but not least, we have Hannah Kawas. Hannah Kawas is a Palestinian activist, writer, and journalist who was born in Bethlehem, Palestine. He is the chairperson of the Canada-Palestine Association. Big round of applause for Hannah. Okay. With that said, I'll give it away to our speakers. Here we go, Omri.
Hi, folks. Yeah, I'm glad that I got a seat. That's the real reason that I'm speaking tonight. Yeah, so grateful to be here, so grateful for the organizing that's taken place. I just really have to say how inspired I've been a lot by the work of these 2 folks at the table. Let's just give it up for them. The work of but yeah, there's just been an outpouring of action. People have known what to do and they've done it, and we're gonna continue to do that. So I'll just start with that and continue with my remarks now. So yeah, my name is Omri Haven. I've been actively working to dismantle Israeli apartheid and Zionism since I was an awkward teenager, or an awkward preteen. I'm a Jew, I'm an anti-Zionist, I'm a member of Independent Jewish Voices, and a trade unionist. I'm also part of a group of rad Jews who are currently working towards building anti-Zionist Jewish organizing in so-called Vancouver. And I was going to be leaving to go to a meeting of that group, but I mean, who could pass this opportunity up? It's really amazing, and this is what movement building is all about. Luckily for me, I was raised in a family of avowed anti-Zionist Jews. My parents, both trade union organizers and founders of Independent Jewish Voices and other groups, have been working hand in hand with Palestinian liberation organizers since the 1970s. So when I told my mom that I would be speaking at this, and I couldn't call her tonight, she texted me back, and I'll read the text. She said, "Good luck tonight, Omri. Remember, there will be cops in the audience, so watch what you say." So yeah, that gives you a sense of the tenor of the way that I was brought up. I really enjoy, you know, you get the love, and then you get the kind of like fierceness, and then a bit of like, oh, okay, you've been organizing for a bit.
Hopefully they join us.
We'll see, yeah. They're gonna have to put down their badges before that, but yeah. So I've met some of my closest friends while doing work for the Palestinian liberation cause. Ever since the age of 12, when my name was put on a website denouncing me and my parents as self-hating Israel trashers, otherwise known as the shit list, if folks remember back to that era. So I've known the score since then, and I'm now 33. The score is this: Israel and its many allies in the West will stop at nothing except the total elimination of Palestinian resistance, and Israel and its allies will continue to orchestrate a McCarthyite witch hunt, very appropriate for the venue that we're in, a McCarthyite witch hunt for everyone they see as not supporting them to the hilt. We all know this. The bludgeon of anti-Semitism has been used to silence both Jews and non-Jews alike at this point, and it's been 75 years. But we're all starting to become aware that Israel does not speak on behalf of Jews, and that anti-Semitism will continue and only grow worse as long as we confuse the state of Israel with the Jewish people. In fact, the State of Israel is a convenient excuse for countries like Canada, the US, France, Poland, Germany, the UK to not deal with their fundamental problems of white supremacy and racism. Supporting Israel no matter what atrocities they commit is seen as a replacement for actual anti-fascism and actual reconciliation with the history of anti-Semitism that led to the Jewish Holocaust. This has been to the detriment of our shared humanity and to the benefit of totalitarianism in Israel that we're seeing emerge further and further every day. Closer to home, politicians like Trudeau cannot continue to support Israel's war crimes while claiming to also be in favor of social justice. The electorate sees through it, and we have the polling numbers to prove that. We know that they're 16 points behind the Conservatives because the electorate sees that they're talking out of both sides of their mouth, and that these political acrobatics are making Trudeau less and less popular. We need a broad anti-racist and anti-fascist movement that can defend all minorities while seeking justice and freedom for oppressed people. When people are occupied, resistance is justified. When people are occupied, resistance is justified. When people are occupied, resistance is justified. So I'm going to say also, just in terms of talking about unionism, the work of standing up to Israel's murderous assault belongs to all of us, and every contribution is worthwhile. This is especially true for those of us who are workers and have a stake in controlling the means of production. This includes cultural production, intellectual production, social reproduction, the service industry, the shipping industry, the agricultural industry, and so on. 2 years ago, at my last job, I helped to organize a union through the BCGEU at Kawasa Neighborhood House. Many of us were excited to join the union initially. We had an 80% vote, or 80% vote in favor of joining. Our enthusiasm ebbed over a short time. Why was this? When you are a worker who is passionate and newly organized, you need to feel a part of something greater than yourself, in addition to the struggle for your rights and the upkeep for your standard of living. You need social unionism. By this I mean a union that will advocate in the workplace and on the street. Where has BCGEU been over the past month and a half of bombings in Gaza? While BCGEU has made many great strides over the past 10 years, there is still a culture of corporate unionism that is endemic in BC, Canada, and of course North America. I pick on BCGEU, but it is actually arguably the most progressive large union in the province, with the exception of Cup W, present company accepted. Okay. Where has the Canadian Labour Congress been to defend the jobs of the many who have been fired or disciplined for speaking out on the genocide in Gaza? But strides are being made. We heard from many committed trade unionists earlier about that, and we know that human rights issues are workers' issues. When Palestinians call on us to shut it down, who better than workers to take action? Since September, I've been part of the Teaching Support Staff Union at Simon Fraser University. The TSSU is exemplary in their commitment to both social unionism and also to bread and butter issues for our members, or its members. This has to do with their avowed social unionism, their explicit feminism, and their fiercely independent roots. This fall, we went on strike for better pay, better contract, better conditions, and the university management actually hired a Lionsgate risk management group to spy on us on the picket line. Shame. Shame. This is the same company that was hired to oppress the Indigenous resistance at Fairy Creek. This is the same company that was hired to oppress Indigenous resistance against the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Shame. Shame. Thanks to the work of some people in this room, we shamed SFU into dropping these private spies. The struggle against colonial repression is waged on many fronts. I want to leave you with some facts about the Canadian complicity in Israeli apartheid and genocide. I'm sure there are more, but here are a few. More than $26 million in arms is shipped to Israel every year. This number increased by a third since 2020. tax-deductible charity status for organizations like the Hesed Foundation and the Canadian Zionist Cultural Association that send soldiers to Israel and help fund the IDF are helping these organizations stay in the reign of power.
Oh, for
Shame.
Shame.
The Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement is bad for workers everywhere and supports apartheid by promoting products made in the occupied West Bank. A lot of folks here have done a lot of work on boycott, divestment, and sanctions. I'm sure that will be talked about later. Shame.
Shame.
Minister Chrystia Freeland, who some of us remember from when several hundred individuals crashed her Liberal Party fundraiser a few weeks ago, said Canada would act as an asset to Israel if we got onto the UN Security Council. Luckily, organizers stopped this. Canada is doubling down on apartheid. Canada is doubling down on war profiteering. Canada is doubling down on acting as a diplomatic cover for genocide. And Canada is continuing its legacy of settler, colonial, and white supremacist ethnic cleansing. Shame.
Shame.
Who has the power to stop this? Working people and students have the power to stop this. Who has the power to build the future we all deserve? Working people and students of all stripes. Before coming here, I held my last tutorial with my students for the semester. I'm a teaching assistant now. The topic was critical discourse analysis, a skill we could all use these days. Looking around the room, I saw a huge diversity of faces looking back at me. And even before I started the lesson, I knew that these working class young people already understood what power was and how it was abused. They understood how racism is used as a tool to divide us against each other by the masters of war. They understood that their futures have been exchanged for profit because they too understand the score. And they've learned how to critically analyze as a matter of survival. Let's help them turn that into action. Thank you.
Thank you, Omri, for those remarks. They were very insightful, particularly when talking about both about Canadian complicity and also about the role that we can play here. Because, one of the things that's come up recently, and I also just want to salute my fellow speakers for all of the work that they've been doing over the past weeks, but also the past years. And just to note that there's around 4 or 5 chairs that have been vacated, and just knowing that there's tens and dozens of people who haven't sat down. If folks would like to grab a chair, I just want to encourage people that, there's 5 or 6 chairs around. Please don't feel bad about taking a seat because it would be great for some folks to be able to get off their feet. So, one of the things that we hear all the time, especially in the recent era, is, on the one hand, we will hear these declarations from politicians, which are, Canada stands with Israel, and these really proud declarations of solidarity with genocide and settler colonialism. And then when they start to see that the popular sentiment is skewing over 75, 76, 77, 78%, at the very least in favor of a ceasefire and in greater solidarity with Palestine than perhaps any other time in Canadian history, suddenly they start talking about how Canada is a medium power and doesn't have the ability to do anything about the situation. And so therefore, clearly, the response to being a medium power and not having the capacity to do anything about the situation is certainly then to keep on supporting the genocide, apparently. And I think it's really important to remember these things, like the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement. And it's really important to remember that people are fundraising for settlements here. And it's really important to remember, and I know we're going to talk more about this later, that one of Canada's big 5 banks is investing in Elbit Systems, Israel's largest weapons manufacturer that produces 85% of its arms drones. That's Scotiabank. And that Canada's largest chain bookstore, Indigo Chapters, its CEO, Heather Reisman, runs a charity, a so-called charity, which again is eligible to receive charitable donations, when almost no organization in Palestine working on Palestine in Canada, except for a very few, are eligible to get charitable status to begin with, in order to send people to fight as so-called lone soldiers in the Israeli occupation forces. Like literally, essentially, recruiting people to become mercenaries for the Zionist regime in occupied Palestine and rewarding them for doing that with scholarships and funds. And yet, when people go and poster on the windows of an Indigo bookstore, again, the largest single chain bookstore in Canada, they're labeled anti-Semites committing a hate crime against a Jewish-owned business. Hey, this is a publicly traded company. You know, it's a complete falsehood and misrepresentation, but it's a fact that this complicity is material. It's not just theoretical. And so every excuse about how Canada is a small power, a medium power, can't do anything about the situation, despite being a G7 economy, despite being one of the major resource extractors and producers in the world, is, complete nonsense, essentially, and is an excuse to allow genocide to continue. And as Omri brought up, workers create wealth. Workers in nature create all wealth. And so there's no better power on this land than that of workers, especially combined and united with the struggles of Indigenous people to fight back and to stand for justice and liberation in Palestine. From the very beginning of the Palestinian struggle, Palestine has always been a working class cause, and Palestinian workers and farmers and the popular classes of Palestine have always been at the center of the struggle for liberation. From the earliest days of Zionist colonialism and British colonialism in Palestine in the 1910s, the 1920s, the 1930s, Palestinian workers were organizing themselves in the cities of Palestine. In the 1936 through 1939 revolution in Palestine, Palestinian workers led a 6-month general strike that was at that time the largest general strike in history to liberate themselves from British colonialism and British support for Zionist colonialism. And it was in that battle that the British began not just carrying out the Balfour Declaration of promising the land of Palestine to Zionist colonialism, but also shipping weapons to the Zionist colonizers to fight the battle for them on their behalf. And of course, we're still seeing today the Zionist colonizers fighting the battle for imperialism on the land of Palestine today. And in that battle, the British colonizers blew up and destroyed the homes of Palestinians, assassinated and executed, along with their partners and their allies, labor leaders and organizers struggling for Palestinian liberation. And it's the same thing and the same tactics that we see today. And of course, the British also introduced to Palestine what we call today administrative detention. That is, the policy of imprisoning Palestinians for up to 6 months at a time, indefinitely renewable, arbitrarily under a military order, with Palestinians being jailed for years upon years at a time. Currently, since October 7th, there are over 2,000 of the 8,000 Palestinians held in occupation prisons are held under administrative detention. 2 days ago, 33 administrative detention orders were signed. Today, 22 administrative detention orders are signed. So this massive and industrial use of administrative detention is something that is 100% being used by the Zionists, and it's also something that's a direct carryover from British colonialism.
Shame.
And I think it's important to talk about the fact that Palestine has always been a working class struggle, and that Palestinian workers have always organized themselves and fought back, because of the fact that Zionism has been historically misrepresented as like a labor-based and progressive movement. Now, obviously today, when we look at what the Zionist project is, when we look at Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir, when we hear from Bezalel Smotrich, when we hear these absolutely genocidal declarations about razing Gaza to the ground, about not leaving one of them alive, about how Palestinians are human animals, nobody is going to mistake this for a left-wing discourse. But we also see at the same time the pinkwashing, the faux feminism, the presentation of Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims as a whole as somehow less progressive than this absolutely nefarious, genocidal, imperialist colonial project planted in the heart of the Arab region. And historically, the Histadrut has been portrayed as like, there was socialist Zionism. The kibbutzes were, building a socialist project. It wasn't about occupying Palestinian land, displacing the Palestinian people, and building heavily militarized settlements, which is the reality. That project of, Zionist labor was always based on the exclusion of Palestinian labor, but it's also a reality that the Zionist project has continued to rely and depend on Palestinian labor to build and run its factories, its construction projects, its all of the labor and work that the Zionists do not want to do themselves and see it as below their role in the settler society are areas of work that are assigned to Palestinian workers. And so Palestinian children labor in Zionist factories in Jerusalem and in occupied Palestine 48, Palestinian children from the West Bank. Palestinian construction workers from Gaza are imported into occupied Palestine in order solely to produce construction work and build the buildings of the Zionist project on their own stolen land from which their families were expelled 75 years ago during Al-Nakba. That's why there were 4,000 workers from Gaza that were rounded up, thrown in concentration camps, tortured, abused, beaten up, 2 of them killed, 1 of them we don't even know his name, all just in the month and a half since October 7th. Because that's why we're seeing in the prisoner exchanges that are taking place, we're seeing Thai and Filipino workers being released, not because their exchange was negotiated by the Zionist regime, but rather because their own governments contacted the Qataris, the Egyptians, and other mediators asking for the release of their citizens. Because the Zionist project is not a labor-based project. It's not a working class project. There's not an argument for solidarity and unity between the Israeli working class and the Palestinian working class. The reality is that this is a settler project, an imperialist colony that's been planted in the heart of the Arab region, and it's the Palestinian struggle that is a working class struggle, that is a liberation struggle, that is fighting imperialism on the front lines. And furthermore, when we look at the Palestinian struggle, when we look at the Palestinian fighters who are on the front lines defending their land, when we look at the people who make up the Al-Qassam Brigade, Soraya Al-Quds, the members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the members of Fatah, the armed fighters who take to the streets of Jenin to defend their land against the colonizers, the people in the refugee camps who are fighting back, the thousands of prisoners inside the occupation prisons, these are the popular classes of Palestine. These are workers and peasants and displaced refugees. The few individual Palestinian capitalists who have sought to make a compromise with the Israeli occupation in order to, maintain their privileges or have a home for capital or develop their resources, those are not the people fighting for the liberation of Palestine. When we see Palestinian resistance struggling for liberation, those are Palestinian working class people doing that. Those are Palestinian refugees. Those are marginalized Palestinian people. When we hear about the occupation forces conducting a raid, it's either into a village or into a refugee camp or into an area of the city, and almost always the most impoverished and marginalized areas of the city. Because it's the Palestinian masses that have built every aspect of this struggle. And so these forces that we see are not separate from the Palestinian masses. Instead, they were created by them. And in many ways, they represent them. And they represent them because they're looking for liberation and they're looking for an alternative to this endless, seemingly endless nightmare of colonialism, of genocide, of forced deportation, of mass imprisonment, of land confiscations, home demolitions, of killing and destruction and slaughter that have been imposed upon the Palestinian people for over 75 years of Zionist colonialism and over 100 years of British colonialism. So if we want to talk about how do we build labor solidarity with Palestine, we have to begin with building anti-imperialist unionism. The struggle for the liberation of Palestine, it's not just a struggle against Israel standing alone by itself, this Zionist country in the heart of the region. It's a struggle against this Israeli occupation, to be sure. But who backs that up? How does that continue to survive? How does that continue to last? Not just because of the ingenuity and dedication of Zionist colonialism, but because it's backed up by the support of every single imperialist power in the world. I mean, if that wasn't clear before, it sure is clear after October 7th. When we see Biden not just giving the $4 billion in weapons, but pledging an additional $14 billion in weapons, sending 2 aircraft carriers to the region. When we see everyone from Melanie Joly to Emmanuel Macron to Rishi Sunak rushing to Tel Aviv to declare that this is all of our struggle. When they say this is all of our struggle, for us, this is all of their struggle. This is the struggle of the bosses, the exploiters, the big capitalists, the imperialists, everyone that oppresses workers, everyone that benefits from racism, everyone that benefits from colonialism, everyone that benefits from land theft, essentially everyone who is responsible for all of our misery, they stand with Israel. They stand with Zionism. So the challenge for us is not just how do we most effectively stand in solidarity with Palestine because we feel sorry for Palestinians or because we feel sympathy, but also because of the reality that if we want to win, if we want a better world for all of us, right now, the Palestinian people, and at the heart of it, the Palestinian resistance, are right on the front lines paying the greatest price and living through the greatest sacrifices and experiencing the greatest suffering so that all of us might actually see a world that means something else than imperialism, exploitation, oppression, racism, and colonialism. And we owe it to the Palestinian people and their resistance. And we owe it to Indigenous people here. And we owe it to all of us as workers, as working class people, as the workers of the world, to fight together and to stand with those resistance forces, to stand with every Palestinian resistance fighter, every Palestinian political prisoner, and also every Palestinian child whose home has been demolished around him. And we owe it to stand with every Palestinian fisher whose boat has been bombed by occupation forces, every farmer whose land and olive trees have been torn up and burned by the bulldozers imported from Canada, the United States, France, and Germany. To stand with every Palestinian worker who fought back to free himself from a settlement that was built with his own hands on his own stolen and confiscated land. We have an obligation and a duty, not just out of charity, not just out of pity, not just out of, feeling bad that this is happening or feeling guilty about what's being done by the Canadian government, but because this is the potential for the world that all of us want to see. A world where these horrors don't exist anymore because we don't have to live in this reality forever. That's what our movements are all about. They're not just about changing it incrementally, but about getting rid of this altogether. And we see examples around the world, right? Like we're seeing that Zionists actually identify the labor movement as a major threat because it's one of those social forces that when the labor movement changes and takes a clear position, it means the imperial core at a popular level can no longer be relied upon to maintain this project. And that is a challenge not just to Zionism, but to the political and economic forces that are responsible for not just the Zionist project, but for all of the misery that we see here as well. So in Barcelona, we see dock workers refusing to load cargo for arms manufacturers bound for Israel. In Belgium, we see 5 transport unions making the same pledge. They won't load, they won't ship it. If it's arms and support going to the Israeli occupation, they won't load it. We see the same pledge from the ship workers of Japan. We see workers in India. There's an attempt by the Indian government of Narendra Modi to negotiate a deal to send 60,000 Indian workers to occupied Palestine to replace the Palestinian workers from Gaza who have been was thrown back into the concentration camp and the open-air prison. There's been an attempt to order this. Well, the Indian trade union movement has come out and said, we are going to organize and we're going to fight back and we're going to stand up against any attempt to send Indian workers as essentially subcontractors and servants for this colonial project. In Italy, workers from one union went on a one-day strike against sending any support to the Israeli occupation. In South Africa, today's march in international solidarity with the Palestinian people was led by the Congress of South African Trade Unions. So we're seeing that labor unions are stepping up around the world. And of course, Palestinian workers are on the front lines and doing this on a daily basis. But we're also seeing more direct actions. We're talking about shutting it down. We're seeing these blockades taking place at arms factories, not just across this land, but in Britain. We're seeing direct damage being done to arms factories, like the campaigns by Palestine Action, which are supported by a growing number of workers and unions to shut Elbit down, the same notorious company that Scotiabank is investing in. We're seeing the Block the Boat actions. It's something we've tried here in Vancouver before. But one of the things that's made it work really well in Oakland and in Tacoma is because the ILWU workers have an alliance with the community organizations that are picketing to stop Israeli so-called Zim shipping company from loading its products and deloading its products and engaging in trade and commerce. Israeli Zim shipping is a fully Israeli-owned shipping company that not only ships most of Israeli arms and weapons material, but also provides ongoing support, sustenance, tax revenue to the Israeli occupation regime. It's a major boycott target, and several Zim ships have been stopped over the years from loading and unloading and docking at the ports of Oakland and in Tacoma. The same thing has been done with US military ships sending weaponry to the Israeli occupation. And ILWU workers have essentially said, you know what, there's a community picket here. And we don't want to risk ourselves. We don't see it as a good situation. So we're going to go home. We're not going to work this shift because there's a community picket. And under our contract, we have the ability to say, we're going to respect this community picket line. We're not going to cross it. We're going to go home and we're not going to load the ship. And what that means is that that takes millions and millions of dollars every day from the bottom line of the Israeli occupation. So we have the capacity to do that here too. Vancouver is a port city, Delta Port is a port city, Zim comes, Zim docks here. We have the capacity to do that too, but for it to be successful, there needs to be an alliance between the community and the union, the community and the workers. The union doesn't need to say, hey, we're going to go on strike in solidarity with Palestine, but there has to be an alliance. It has to be built. That's why we need Labor for Palestine. That's why it's not just a choice to create Labor for Palestine, but why we need it. Because if we want to be able to do things like blocking the boat, Labor for Palestine has to exist. If we want to take the sentiment, the very natural sentiment that health workers feel, to stand in solidarity with Palestinian health workers after hospital after hospital after hospital has been bombed in Gaza, and make that into something material, we need Labor for Palestine. If we want to be able to defend the workers across sectors who have been fired, who have lost their jobs, who are being terrorized at work for standing up and speaking clearly and freely about Palestine, we need Labor for Palestine to organize mass community defense as well as legal support for all of these workers facing firing and harassment, as well as state repression, as we see in the cases that are taking place in Toronto. We always say, this didn't start on October 7th. And of course it didn't. It started 75 years ago. It started with Al-Nakba. It started with British colonialism. It started with the Balfour Declaration. But we can also say that it is true that October 7th did change the world. October 7th changed the world. October 7th presented the possibility that the Zionist project and the colonial occupation of Palestine and the perennial subjugation of the Palestinian people might not endure any longer. That the imperialist grasp on the region is at risk. Because I would be remiss if I did not speak when talking about blocking boats, for example, about how the Yemeni Navy has essentially shut down the shipping route. It's the normal shipping route through the Red Sea for Zionist ships by seizing one of them. Zim has now declared that it's going to reroute. And every single rerouted ship cost Zim millions and millions and millions of dollars.
Yeah.
So from Yemen to Lebanon to Syria to Iraq, this is also a regional resistance, and it's about kicking imperialism out of the region once and for all. So October 7th did change the world. The Palestinian resistance changed the world, and now the barbarity and atrocities of the Israeli occupation, their bombing, their destruction, their tanks, their murders in the West Bank, their slaughtering Palestinians. 2 Palestinians have been killed in the past 2 days simply for being out on the streets celebrating that their own loved ones and community members were being freed by the Palestinian resistance and returned home. That this barbarity has been exposed before the world for what it is. We often talk about how the world has a future choices, socialism or barbarism. Well, many of the Palestinian resistance forces wouldn't necessarily describe themselves as socialist, but we can see in the practice of anti-imperialism, in the practice of humanity, in the practice of commitment to fighting for the greater good, we can see the reality of a commitment to a real positive society that is not based on exploitation, and we can certainly see where barbarism stands. So, we've been here before. We've been here in mass mobilizations for Palestine before in 2009 after the war on Gaza, in 2012, in 2014. There have been large numbers out. Large numbers out for Palestine. Many people wanting to do something. Same thing 2 years ago in 2021. And each time the movement's gotten bigger, the movement's gotten stronger.
Social media.
Yeah, and it's on the basis of that, right? It's on the basis of that we're here tonight as well. But we've been here before, so this time, let's make sure that we institutionalize it. And we take it forward. We take it forward. We come out of here with a real Labor for Palestine chapter. We boycott. We don't feed the arms trade. We cut it off. We're not just fighting for a ceasefire, although that's necessary, and we're certainly not fighting for a two-state solution. We're standing for the liberation of Palestine and with the Palestinian people and for the defeat of imperialism. Let's fight to get Palestinian and Lebanese resistance organizations off the so-called terrorist list. Let's stand with the 8,000 Palestinian political prisoners in Israeli jails and struggle to liberate all of them. And let's stand with the Palestinian resistance, who are those who are on the front lines, fighting to make the better world that we all dream of possible. And let's do everything that we can to stand with them and make our contribution, at least partially, as meaningful as theirs. Because together we can envision and imagine victory for Palestine from the river to the sea. And I want to quote Khaled Barakat from last week's Palestine rally, just in conclusion, which is, he ended his speech last week this way, and I think it's a good way to end what I'm saying today too, which is that every victory for workers here is a victory for the Palestinian people. Every victory for indigenous people here is a victory for the Palestinian people. It's a victory that makes the forces of the people stronger and the forces of capitalism and imperialism weaker. And every victory for Palestine is also a victory for workers here, a victory for indigenous people, a victory for everyone who wants a meaningful future for people and not just for profit. And so let's stand together for victory for Palestine and a Palestine that is free from the river to the sea. Now I'm going to hand it over to Hannah.
I'd like to start with commemorating today the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. This day was enacted at the UN General Assembly in 1977, recognizing that 30 years prior to 1977, in 1947, the United Nations passed the Partition Plan. The Partition Plan, which was unjust and without consulting with the Palestinian people, was passed, although the majority of the population in Palestine were Palestinians. The settler colonialists were just starting to establish their settlements in Palestine, and they didn't have the majority of the land. 6% only of the land belonged to the settler colonialists, the Zionist settlers, and the rest was owned by Palestinians. And more than 80% of the population in historic Palestine were still Arabs and Palestinians. In spite of that, the partition plan gave 56% of the land to the settlers, colonialists, the Zionist settler colonialists in Palestine, and 43% to the supposedly Palestinian state or the Palestinian people. It doesn't add up, right? There is 1.5% was for Jerusalem and Bethlehem to be internationalized. So that's how they divided Palestine, again, without a referendum, without asking the people whether they want to have this division or not. It's good to note that Canada played a major part in this partition plan. Judge Rand, who used to be a Supreme Court judge, Canadian Supreme Court judge, Ivan Rand, his name, he was instrumental in drafting this partition plan. He played a major role in drafting the partition plan. And Lester Pearson, the former Prime Minister, played a major role in passing this partition plan. He played a major role. He used to be Under Secretary of State then. He became then Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and then became Prime Minister. He got rewarded for all this role he played. And then he became a peacemaker. Actually, Chomsky called him war criminal. So, and CBC got mad at Chomsky. How dare he call our hero war criminal? But that's what he was. He was a war criminal. Anyway, then, you know, I'd like just to quote from M.S. Massoud, who was the president of the Canadian Arab Friendship League in 1947. He said the following: the Arab world would remember, and I'm reminding all of you, I'm reminding all the Arab world, would remember Lester B. Pearson and Justice Rand, who did their utmost to impose upon the Arabs the infamous partition plan, the infamous scheme, he called it, the infamous scheme, which was a scheme, really. So, as we see, Canada played a major role in our dispossession, whether through that, whether through after that, they supported this Zionist project. 300 mercenaries went from Canada, although it was against Canadian law, because the Foreign Enlistment Act that was enacted in 1936 for people who went to fight the fascist regime in Spain. They didn't want people to go to fight outside of Canada to fight fascism. So they enacted the Foreign Enlistment Act. Although it was there, but they allowed Zionists to go and fight against, although there was an embargo on any United Nations embargo, and according to the law, the Foreign Enlistment Act, there shouldn't have been anyone to go fight or send equipment. Canada sent equipment to the not the government, but through other Zionist organizations. Even training planes were sent to Israel. training plane from Canada. So it's clear that Canada played a role, and it goes way back to the 20s when Mackenzie King supported the Balfour Declaration. Mackenzie King attended a Zionist conference in Ottawa, I believe, in 1922, and he supported the British, although we know why he supported it, because he was anti-Semitic. Clearly he was anti-Semitic, the same way Balfour was anti-Semites. He wanted to get rid of the Jews from Britain, and Mackenzie King from Canada. And this was the main motivation, in addition to the imperialistic motivation that they want a base for them, what Nahum Chomsky called it, a U.S. aircraft carrier in the Middle East. That what was the purpose of establishing such a state. So it, and it goes all the way, the main objective of the partition plan was to establish a Zionist settler colonial state in Palestine. They weren't concerned about the other 43% which will go, because they cooked up a scheme with the Arab regimes to make sure that such a state won't be established, with King Abdullah, for example, who used to coordinate with the Zionist leadership through Golda Meir. He met with Golda Meir many times to try to forbid the establishment of Palestinian state in Palestine. That's the history, and that's why we here on International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. Canada, all through after the past 76 years since the partition plan, which Canada played a major role, supported this Zionist project. Actually, Canada, let's talk a little bit more about history. Canada co-sponsored a resolution to admit Israel to the United Nations. They co-sponsored it. This resolution, it's 273, I believe, resolution. You could Google it. UN General Assembly Resolution 273. It was conditional on Israel implementing two resolutions. In addition, that they abide by the charter, that the Israel should abide by the charter, which they never abided by the UN charter. But there were two resolutions was conditional on accepting Israel, and Israel never implemented them. One is the partition plan 181, because in 48 they took more than 56 that was allotted to them. They took up to 80%, to be exact, 78% of the total area of Palestine. So they were supposed to implement and go back to the partition plan. Second one was the right of return of the Palestinian people. That Palestinian, who've been ethnically cleansed from Palestine, they amount to 2/3 of the Palestinian people, that they should go back. And Israel never implemented any. Actually, Israel membership at the UN is null and void. But again, they're serving a purpose to implement the plan. And the Zionist movement in its early stages, they weren't hiding it. Like Herzl said, will be a wall, a European wall against Asia. Will be, when they establish this state, the Zionist state, a wall again, a European wall against Asia, a wall, a post, they called it, a post of civilization against barbarism. All Asia was barbarism, including all the way to China and to Japan. But that's how the mentality of this settler colonialist mentality, which was based on supremacism, because we are entitled as white people to do anything, and even to deny the existence of the indigenous people. Again, we see it nowadays that, land without people, Palestine doesn't exist. Although the First Zionist Congress said we want to establish a settler colonial state in Palestine. They called it Palestine. The Balfour Declaration, when they promised the Jews a homeland in Palestine. Again, now they're denying that Palestine exists. That includes the Canadian government, CBC, CTV, and someone mentioned that someone else doesn't want to call it Palestine. But again, Palestine exists, whether they like it or not. Palestine exists. The witness of it is our existence. I'm called Palestinian. I named Palestinian after what? After Palestine. I mean, it's stupid to say it doesn't exist. I mean, there is 14, 15 million Palestinians in the world. How did they come to be called Palestinians, I mean, it's stupid from CB. But again, this is the mentality, or supremacist mentality of the white colonialist, white imperialist, that, if they don't exist. And again, this is the core issue behind genocide. If you deny the existence of people, then you're allowed to do anything to them. And this is what they are doing, really. No. Now, I don't want to go more than that, but I want to talk a little bit about the current situation. The Global News on October 29th reported that a small team of Canadian Special Operations Forces Command, CANSOFCOM, troops, including Elite Joint Task Force 2, GTF2, was sent to Israel.
For shame.
And when it became public, the Liberal MP Mary-France Lalonde, I hope I pronounced her name right, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defense, explicitly denied that Canada was providing military support to Israel in its ongoing assault on the Gaza Strip. Why they were there? We are providing force protection for Canadians and assisting the Canadian Embassy in Israel with contingency planning. You believe that? I mean, the Canada ranks the 28th strongest military in the world. 28th. Israel ranks 17th strongest military in the world. The 28th strongest want to provide security for the embassy, and basically admitting that Israel, the 17th strongest military in the world, can provide security for Canadian embassy. You believe that? I don't. Obviously, they're there to help them, because they said this task force, this what they called it, Elite Joint Task Force 2. I don't know what 2 means, what 1 means. They are there, clearly, they admit that they exchange intelligence with Israel. And they were there when the US declared that they're sending the Delta Force and the SEALs, the Navy SEALs. They went there to liberate the hostages. After 50 days, they couldn't liberate the hostages. Now they are negotiating for the hostages. Why? They couldn't, they are cowards. They couldn't defeat the fighters. Instead, they are killing 5,000 children. 15,000 civilians were murdered in cold blood. And these cowards, they are cowards. And Canada sent this Elite Joint Task Force 2 to help Israel. Again, the same purpose, the same like the Delta Force. They are specialized in releasing hostages, and this is what Canada is doing. So there is blood on the Canadian government hands. Yes. There is blood because they can't deceive us and say, oh, we were there to protect the embassy. Embassy, what is the embassy under attack? And the 17th strongest army in the world can't protect our embassy or other embassies? That's bullshit. They're there to help Israel slaughter Palestinians. And we should hold them accountable.
You mean TikTok instead?
On a positive note, I'm sure this Zionist project will be defeated.
Yeah.
And the Jews will be instrumental in defeating it also, not just us, the Palestinian people. Because it is the ones who are going to be affected by this conflating what Israel does to the Palestinian with Jews and Judaism. They're not. The blood is on Zionist hand, not on the Jewish hand. And we are sure the Zionists will be held accountable for their crimes, not the Jews, the Zionists. Actually, during the Second World War, the Zionists were collaborating with Nazi Germany rather than saving Jews. You know, and Mr. Mackenzie King, when they wanted to come here, the Jews were escaping the Holocaust. You know, his famous statement is well known. There is a book written about it called "None is Too Many." None is too many. He didn't want any Jew to be received here in Canada. He wanted to send them to Palestine to establish that base for them. And you know, I said it many times in my speeches. Jews are safe everywhere in the world except in Israel. Although the Zionist movement promised Jews a safe haven in Palestine. This is it. You can't have a safe haven on top of the rubble of 500,000 Palestinian villages. 500, they destroyed 500,000 villages in Palestine. They wiped out of the map of the earth. 2/3 of the Palestinian people being ethnically cleansed from their homeland. How are you going to have safe haven on top of the skulls of the Palestinian people? You can't have a safe haven on the skulls of the Palestinians. You won't have safety nor security without, you know, dismantling this Zionist ideology that is really promoting not just anti-Semitism, but promoting wars and supporting the most despotic regimes all over the world, including Arab regimes, from the Emirates all the way to Morocco. They are imposing them on the Arab people. This won't last long. The Arab people will topple all these agent regimes and will be free. You know, I don't know if people heard, what's his name, Trump. he said, you know, I think you will find it on YouTube. He said, I picked up the phone and phoned bin Salman, the king of Saudi Arabia, and I told him, King, you have lots of money. We want some of it. You should send us some of that money. He said, you know, King, without us, you can't last 2 weeks. This is what he said, admitting that the U.S. empire that promotes democracy and human rights are imposing on the Arab people these dictatorships. He was frank about it. He didn't hide it. The others, they try to be, we're promoting human rights by putting dictatorship on the Arab people, by promoting dictatorship. This will end soon. October 7th will change the history of the world. And all these traitors, including our traitor in Ramallah, who claimed to represent the Palestinian people, he'll be held to account. Mr. Abbas. What's his first name? Anyway, we will be victorious, and I again thank you for all your support. I'll just leave you with a positive note. We started here in in Vancouver, BDS, Vancouver Coast Salish Territory. It's a committee of Canada-Palestine Association. We started a campaign to boycott Air Canada because Air Canada had a contract with the Israel airspace industry. I think it was 2 years contract. We started the campaign for a few months, and then the Canadian BDS coalition adopted the campaign, and we did the petition, and you know, they didn't listen to us. To be frank, the Air Canada didn't give a damn about us. Until Canadian trade unions from the East and from the Maritime, it's regrettably, we didn't get much support in BC, but the East and the Maritime, they put their name on the petition. After that, 2 or 3 weeks, Air Canada ended the contract with the Israeli airspace. And this is the kind of work we can do together. And thank you all.
Thank you so much to our 3 panelists, Omri, Charlotte, and Hannah. We have decades of Palestine solidarity work at this table. If you've been to any Palestine solidarity event or rally, be assured that these folks were involved somehow. So let's give it up again for all their hard work over the decades. And some important things out here were said tonight, right, about how us as trade unionists, we have a duty to support the working class of Palestine, that they have a right to resist, and we have a duty to support them, right? And in our support, we are anti-imperialist, we are anti-Zionist, we are anti-apartheid. And we know that it was the working class of South Africa and the working class and labor here who brought down apartheid in South Africa. And looking around this room, I see faces who were involved in that movement back then. And that really shows that labor can and we will do this. We will do this. And of course, as our panelists spoke about today, Canada supports the Zionist regime, but we as labor activists, we do not. So as labor activists, it's time that we put Palestine on our agendas in our unions. And if they are already on the agendas, then push further. That is our duty. And so for tonight, we've had a lot was said here tonight. We've gone over time than what we planned. We planned to have a discussion, but we also know that this is just the first of many events that we have to plan to get started for Labor for Palestine and to do this work. So what we propose tonight, I know an email list went around to sign up, that we continue the discussion next time. So Regine's going to talk about what this looks like.
Thank you, Kayla, and thank you again for firstly our speakers. You are amazing. Every word was so powerful, and I think this is an important educational for all of us, whether we're in a union or we're not. Thanks to our unionists for coming out and giving greetings, and of course, thanks to all of you guys for coming out and supporting this event. So again, unfortunately, we don't have time for this more in-depth discussion, but that doesn't mean it ends here. On Wednesday, December 13th, we're going to have our first official Labor for Palestine meeting, where we're also going to be zooming in some organizers from Labor for Palestine National. So particularly if you're in a union and you want to take a more organizing role in this chapter here in Vancouver, please attend. We'll send more updates and details about time and place for that. And yeah, exactly. That's just the first step. I'm going to end it with a Howard Zinn quote. He said, "Civil disobedience is not our problem. Our problem is that people are obedient all over the world in the face of poverty and starvation and stupidity and war and cruelty." And I always say this to my students, and I get them to analyze this because that's what's important. They shame us for standing up for resisting throughout history, or they silence us in our schools, or they, silence our students if they want to do things for Palestine. But we're not going to be silenced, and the actual crime is being silent in what's going on right now. So I'm very excited in organizing with you all. Thanks again for coming out, and feel free to have some informal conversations. Please sign up, especially if you're in a union over there. There are some amazing leaflets up at the front over there. Luke, maybe you can wave your hand. Please grab some. This one, again, is guidance sheet for trade unionists on building solidarity with Palestine. So if you don't have the capacity to get involved in Labor for Palestine, at least take this and think about ways to bring it back into your union. There's a really wonderful CAPW statement, and that could be an inspiration if you want to have your unions and your locals write up statements. And again, a little bit more about Labor for Palestine. The statement on the basis of unity is also printed up there. Thanks again, and enjoy your evening. Before you leave, 1 second.
Just to let you folks know, there is an event that's happening 12:30 p.m. on Saturday at the Robson location of Indigo. We know that the HESEG Foundation, so to speak, is responsible for around $5 million going towards propping up people from this country who are crazy enough to fight in the Israeli Defense Forces. And so we need to show Heather Rice-Mindra-Schwartz that that is not okay. It has happened before in this city, and it will happen again. We're going to shut down Indigo. And I just also wanted to maybe give the mic over. Sorry. Yeah.
Sure. So right after this action, come join us, the Vancouver Art Gallery, again for another mass march and rally for Palestine. This weekend, you've been coming out. Thousands and thousands of people have come out each week. Please, there's just as around 10 minutes ago, the so-called humanitarian pause was set to expire, and around 3 minutes before then, a word came in that there was an official statement from Hamas that the so-called humanitarian pause had been extended for 1 day. But it's really important to keep in mind that, as we all know and as we've all said, that's not a solution. It's not even a ceasefire, let alone the liberation of Palestine, breaking the siege, or any of the other demands that we're fighting for. So it's so important that we continue to bring all of ourselves and our friends and our comrades out into the streets. Come out again, come to the Indigo Picket, then come over to the Vancouver Art Gallery. We're officially starting at 3 p.m. If you come by at 2, we'll still be there organizing and mobilizing. So come over to the Vancouver Art Gallery after the Indigo Picket. Oh, and good point. Yes, thank you for the reminder. That's not the only event. Tomorrow night, there's a health worker Solidarity for Palestine event, Thursday, November 30th at 5:30 p.m. outside the CBC building in downtown Vancouver. It's led by health workers, but everyone is welcome to come to stand in solidarity with Palestinian health workers, Palestinian patients, and people fighting to maintain health despite genocide, siege, and occupation and bombardment.